Howdy. Welcome to Ausgrave Royalty. I am Justin. No script at the moment. This is a bonus video. We have big news, as you can probably see from the title of the video. I'm pleased to bring to you my interview with Michael Pierce regarding our discussion on Jungian typology, the mbti stuff. This is a big, it's a big event for a lot of reasons. So I'm going to unpack this the best I can. First, I just want to say Michael was a class act. Ever since I reached out to him and even during our interview and afterwards, just a great dude, and I'm proud that he was the channel's first interviewee. I always, this is a newer channel, of course, and if for the real fans who have watched all my post-mortem videos on the channel, y'all would know that interviewing somebody was always something kind of on my mind. But this interview came about very, spontaneously. I don't remember what led me back to his channel, but I ended up there and watched a few of his videos, and it struck me that our topics are very related. This channel is covering Jungian archetypes. He's covering Jungian typology, which is something I didn't plan on personally covering. So I thought that would be a good meeting, a good rounding out of some of the Jungian stuff. And yeah, I thought that'd be good for the viewer. It's natural to think of that sort of thing when learning about archetypes, like how does it relate to the mbti stuff, which also comes from Jung. So instead of starting from square one, I reached out to Michael in kind of this spirit of having a conversation about it. And yeah, it just, as I told him, the whole way through communicating with him, it was like, is this too good to be true? Like, everything's going so smoothly. I'm more of a consumer of YouTube than a producer, even though I've produced a lot of videos by now. And I always wondered, what it's like to reach out to a content creator who's vastly more experienced and what, the dialogues are behind the scenes. And in the best way possible, it was very anticlimactic, which I'm pleased to say. It was just, hey, you want to chat? Yeah. Cool, when? This time. Okay. That's it. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure if I interview more people on the channel, I'm sure it won't always go that smoothly. But it definitely opened my eyes to how smooth things can go, how possible it is to, knock on somebody's digital door, so to speak, and just ask. And this is I'm nobody, I'm just an average dude, and all I can do is ask, right? And that's what happened, and it worked out. So I'm just, thrilled about everything that's taken place with Michael in the interview. And I don't know how to I had to research as best I could, what app to use to do the interview, just the hardware involved. That's my kryptonite, the hardware. I couldn't get my webcam working, and you'll see so right before the interview, I had a crazy I had an event for like my 9 to 5 job that almost made me late, but luckily it didn't. I had plenty of time. But I kind of was worried about that, and I had to set up and move my like curtain to like for the background and all that. Excuse me. Um, Getting it right for my other computer setup, and like the quality. It's like I bought this high def webcam, and the quality wasn't high definition in my opinion. So I'm looking for how to adjust the properties of it, and to no success. I'm just like scrambling right before trying to get all this set up, and I chose StreamYard. I heard from like kind of a matter of fact passing by comment on the rare time I watch Chris Williamson. I think that's his name. He just made a comment that he recommends StreamYard. I think I could be remembering this totally wrong. So I tried StreamYard, and like my interview with, like, I did a few StreamYard tests just to see that it was alive and there was a pulse, that it was working, and I could record something and have it logged and saved, and that seemed to be the case. So yeah, I took a chance. You know, there was a lot that could have gone wrong on the hardware side, and you know, I'll get better at this, dear viewer, that I'll sort out the HD issue with the quality, and I'll get a better view on the camera. For some reason, I had it right at one point where it was like my upper body was better framed, kind of like you're seeing now. But in the interview, it like zoomed out. So I guess it's like default setting. I don't know. And I'm like, I look like in anime, there's the character with the glasses, and then like you just see the lights on the lenses, you know? I look like that every excuse me, here and there on the interview, just like the monitor with my notes. Like there's so many hardware things like lighting and all that. I just you know, sometimes you got to run before you can walk, as Iron Man says. So yeah, but the interview started, and yeah, I just luckily it recorded fine, and there were no, you know, aside from the video quality and the view and all that, there were no kind of deal breakers. Like I was able to send the recording successfully, and I'm just grateful for that. It could have been all for nothing, you know. And I'm extrapolating all this just as I'm a new YouTuber, and anyone who might be thinking about like, ooh, what goes on behind the scenes, you know. Because I've always been curious about that. But anyway, hopefully I'm open to other interviews. I don't have anyone like concrete in mind lined up as of this moment. I'm working on the next season involving Robert Johnson. I was going to say James Hillman, but that's for a season later. But Robert Johnson will be the next season on the channel, and I've been chipping away at that. Anyway, I really enjoyed, you know, all caps. I really enjoyed speaking with Michael, and hopefully we'll talk again. Afterwards, we chatted, and he said he was open to it. So we'll see. He's in grad school, so I ain't gonna be that guy bothering him for another interview. He needs. Grad school's not easy. It's not pleasant. So it won't be anytime soon. But if we feel that there's a significant reason, I'm sure we'll come together again. And, of course, dear viewer, we want to know how you liked it. And this is a personal request from me, but give me as much feedback as possible. Like, I did interrupt him a few times, which, you know, I'm slightly ashamed of. I say only slightly because it's more of a conversation than an interview. I'm not Barbara Walters. This isn't super formal. On the other hand, that doesn't mean I can just interrupt people whenever I want. I tried to, do my best to keep things going. And yeah, let me know how you found the quality of the questions, what I could have done better. I'm aware of the hardware shortcomings. Any suggestions there would be good constructive suggestions. And yeah, the more feedback, the better. It's going to help the channel a lot. So that would be my humble request for the viewer. And of course, I really hope you all get something out of it. We talked not so much about particular MBTI types. I wanted to avoid that because he's already covered that a lot on his channel very well. I wanted to just ask him sort of meta psychology questions like, what is this thing called a personality? And, what does it mean to analyze it? Where does it come from? And stuff like that. So yeah, I hope y'all enjoy the conversation. Looking forward to hearing from y'all. And thank you again to Michael. All right, y'all. Here's the interview. Bye-bye. All right. Welcome.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. I always like doing this sort of thing.
Yeah, and welcome to the viewer. We have Michael Pierce here, and we're going to be talking about some Jungian typology among anything else. It's like the Joe Rogan experience, except
yeah.
less weed and less millions of dollars,
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Less millions.
Michael, million. You and I haven't met before, have we?
Nope.
This is our first time chatting.
This is our first time chatting other than email to set this up. So you sent me an email, and I'm generally very amenable to talking with people who want to talk with me. I looked at your channel first, of course, to make sure you were a real person, et cetera, et cetera.
That's good.
Because but yeah, and I saw the stuff that you've been putting out, whilst not Jungian typology related, is still very much up my alley, in my opinion. So
yeah,
I figured it'd be an interesting conversation.
I agree. I have good taste, not to brag, but for the viewer. So. Oh, what's that?
I think so.
Oh yeah. All right. You're on board. For the viewer, I reached out to Michael on a whim. I'm a channel floating in the Oort cloud of YouTube. I'm really nowhere, and Michael has been superbly gracious in communication and working with me to set this up. So, I can't thank you enough. This is interview number 1 for me, like ever. So I've got this like freaking like bright sun of a light. Like my production value is very, very low. My face is like pale because of the brightness of the monitor. I'm like, but at the same time, you gotta run before you can walk. I don't know if that made sense, but
no, it does. I think honestly, you're doing a wonderful job. The fact you've even thought about some of these things. I've been in a number of interviews, and you're one of the more gracious and thought out hosts that I've worked with. I don't. By the way, if anybody watches, I don't mean that as. Anyway, I hope other people who I've interviewed don't suddenly think, "Is he talking about me?" No, I'm complimenting you on how much thought and everything you put into it. It's
that means a lot.
Yeah, I feel like I've been, in comparison, sort of all over the place, and so I feel like you've been very patient with me. So, thank you.
You bet.
You for that.
So I want to tell you just about me in my own words. So yeah. I'm not just some weirdo on the internet. I want you to know I'm a weirdo on the internet. Big difference. So I actually have my bachelor's degree in philosophy.
Oh, okay.
And oh yeah. We got to stick together.
That's right.
And
yeah.
I majored for love, not for practicality. I'm sure we can talk forever about that. the stigma and woe is me and all that, but maybe for another time at the discretion of our viewer. But I was reading like Schopenhauer when I was 15. I like discovered it in high school. I just like fell in love with it right away. I had this cassette tape series by Charlton Heston.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Dude, seriously.
I never had it on cassette. So I got into philosophy later than you did. I've always thought philosophically and been interested in philosophical problems, but I didn't start really reading philosophy and like Plato and Aristotle and those guys until, how old would I have been? Probably 20, 21 or so. So I began later, and then I got into maybe it was a little bit earlier than that, but in any case, the upshot is that I found I had it on like an iTunes thing. Like I found the what was it, the Giants of Philosophy?
That's it.
By Charlton
Heston. Nailed it.
Yeah. I listened to a number of those several times, some more than others. I listened to the Nietzsche one like several times over, just because I was trying to get a handle on them. It's been forever since I've listened to those. Those were great.
I have them in my closet right now. For the viewer, those are underrated AF in my opinion. Like if you just want an introduction to St. Thomas Aquinas, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, he goes over all of it. And maybe it's nostalgia. I haven't listened to it. I don't even have a cassette player, to be honest, but I refuse to part with them. Anyway, that's how I got my intro. And then like Schopenhauer resonated with me the most at that time. I remember I was playing an RPG called Disgaea and listening to Schopenhauer. Not exactly the typical American teenager. So that's where my start began. And then it's what I loved. And I was told back then, it doesn't matter what your major is so much as you graduate at all. Like just get your degree. We don't care what it is, just that you have a bachelor's degree. And that's what every voice was telling me. So I was like, well, all things being equal, I'm just going to major in what I love, philosophy. So, I'll fast forward a bit. I graduated. It was a little messy here and there, but I decided to go to grad school actually, but I hated it my first semester. And I know you're having I'm sure you can identify for those who don't know, Michael is in grad school right now in philosophy. Yes. So for him to be doing this during that is all the more kudos. But
thank you.
I along the way I discovered Stefan Molyneux. I don't know if you've ever
heard of him. Yes, I've heard of him. I know very little about him. Bits here and there. I think I get him confused sometimes with other people in that space, but I recognize the name. So
well, his Wikipedia doesn't read very well.
Okay.
TLDR, he was kind of 1984 non-person from the internet. That's a long story.
Okay.
But I'm trying to make this quick so I don't yap on forever. But if I think because I discovered him, it refocused my attitude towards philosophy in such a way that I wanted to focus on applying it to making my life better, not necessarily the study of it. Even though I love the study of it, but I got to thinking like philosophy is kind of like more of like an action movie, like starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's about like the actions you take in life. If you're just learning about philosophy and not applying it to your life in any way, then you're just learning about the history of philosophy, which is nice, but it's easily mistaken for actual philosophy.
Right.
I think Heraclitus said, much knowing doesn't give to understanding, or something like that.
Yeah.
But anyway, to this channel, like I started this channel, I'm fast forwarding a lot for brevity. Fast forward to last year. I think this channel's 10 months old. Long story short, I just uh, I sympathize with my friends too much of me yapping at them about all the crazy stuff I'm interested in. So I thought I'd yap into the world, you know.
Always, that's the great American pastime.
Exactly.
But
Yeah.
no, in all seriousness, that's good. That's
Thank
good.
you. Yeah, I just have like a this artistic bent in me. I've done stand-up
Hmm.
comedy. I've made electronic music. Um, I I have my hand in all these things, and I thought like a YouTube channel might be a way to go. So
Hmm.
to maybe check some of those boxes, and I'm sort of in that dark period where I'm a new channel and I'm doing a lot of work for not much, but it's an
Yeah,
investment, you know.
right.
So one day, and but anyway, I've had a blast learning about. So my channel, Ausgrave Royalty,
Hmm.
is about like big ideas and good ideas, and I'm here to send the flare up. And if people like what they hear, they can go do further research. I'm not an authority on anything. I'm just a casual, average intelligence guy going through the muck like all of us and sharing my observations. So maybe you don't have to read 20 books and I can, you know, spit it out to you, hopefully in a valuable
Hmm.
way on a video. So, um,
And I'll cut in here because
yeah,
I wouldn't consider myself an expert on your channel or anything, but what I've watched, particularly, I was watching through your you were going through Jung's Answer to Job, which I think is a fascinating book. That's what your most recent project you've been working through, and but you've also done a number of other things that are related to Jungian archetypes and psychology, and so I'm giving my recommendation because I've liked what I've seen of what you've done so far. You've done a very good job. You're very thorough, um, academic in the good sense of the word, if that makes any sense.
yeah,
Um, and yeah, I've it's perfect kind of stuff for if you want to play a mindless video game and listen to something that actually flexes your mind. Good stuff because you've got a good voice and everything. Good classic kind of podcast material. But good subject matter, and I think you're approaching it, and you're clearly passionate about it. That's the other thing. I can tell that you care about what you're doing. So
God,
um,
high praise, Michael. I appreciate it.
well, I
That's
do my best. I have watched it, so that's my recommendation. I think people
that's
should
gonna fuel me
check out
for
your stuff.
months, man. You're one of
I
those
sure
compliments.
hope
You
so.
have no idea.
It's the least I
Uh,
can do.
Yeah, ironically, my channel is about big ideas, and I'm planning on covering other things other than archetypal psychology.
Hmm.
But I'm a little sheepish because that's where I started. So maybe some of my subscribers might be like, "Oh, this is an archetypal psychology channel," and I'm gonna about to shift to Tocqueville's Democracy in America, so kind of a political history,
Oh, okay.
and then Ludwig von Mises for some economics, Austrian
Yeah.
economics. Um,
Well, I also think that you're because you're still much smaller. Um, I feel like you have a good freedom to sort of. This is almost like a very good time if you're worried about. Uh, I hate using business language and talking about brand, but that's the best way of putting it. Is that if you're worried about uh, getting too limited in your brand or whatever, or turning people off. Now is the time to make some of those videos to establish, the breadth of your interest. For me, of course, I did not follow that advice. I've begun making. Well, at the beginning, I made some strictly philosophy videos, but they've never been. I've accepted they will never be as popular as the typology videos I've made because that's what I'm known for. But I don't care anymore. I just because money is not involved
right.
at the moment. I've been able to situate myself. I had a Patreon for a while, and then it was petering out anyway, and I finally felt I I I should just close this because it and so I've just been feel more freedom to make um, stuff on whatever I'm interested in, and anyone who wants to listen can. So that's where I'm at with it. But
Yeah, and dude, you can always start a new channel if you want to pivot, right?
that's true. That's true. I've wondered. I've thought about that, but anyway, that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
I feel like, but
Um, So yeah, that's sort of my story. Let's hear about you. You probably told this a lot, but
That's
how'd
fine.
you get into all this? Like, where'd you begin?
Yeah. So into so I my interest in typology came before my strict interest in philosophy, but they kind of occurred around the same time. Um, I got into the story I always tell about typology is it was one evening where me and some friends were playing around with Chinese zodiac stuff. We
Yeah,
were like reading the descriptions for each other and like seeing, oh, who matches up with who, that kind of thing.
yeah,
And it wasn't very convincing or anything, but it sparked an interest. And I was talking with a friend of mine, um, uh, and he mentioned that he had taken the Myers-Briggs type indicator, not the official one, but like a free one online, because there's so many different knockoffs of it, but it's all the same
yeah.
sort of system and principles. Um, and he was like, and the description for that was scary accurate, right? And so I'm like, oh, all right, well, let me see if I can't find one. And so I took one on what at the time was truity.com, and I got INFJ was the code.
Yeah, sorry to
And
cut in real quick. Two
you're
two
good.
things. Uh, I took it when I was around 15 as well, and I got INFJ as well.
I'm not
And we'll
surprised.
talk more about that in a moment. But second minor thing, I think there's some interference with your mic, so just
Oh,
be
is there? Oh, I'm
oh,
sorry. Is
wait.
there?
Well, just then was perfect, but just
Okay.
it's like fading in and out sometimes. So I maybe there's some be like cognizant of like where the mic is. I think
Yeah.
it's like
You're
getting a
all.
little muffled sometimes.
Does it sound okay right now?
It's a little muffled.
It's a little muffled. Okay. How about now?
Slightly better.
Let's figure this out, because I would hate for my rambling along. Tell me where it sounds okay. Uh, is it okay like this,
It's
or
not bad. Right there is good. Right there is good.
okay? Okay. Sorry about that.
No problem. It, it's
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 hooked
it's
up
been
with my
minor, but it would. I wanted to address it early before later.
yeah yeah okay. Yeah, it's hooked in with my headset, so and normally it's worked really well, but let me know if I start fading in and out, and I can repeat things if need be, and so that you get the best possible audio. Um,
Sounds good.
but but anyway, INFJ and the descriptions that I started reading really struck me. Um, a lot of people seem to have this experience where they will feel as though it is some of the descriptions of the type, it is hitting on things that you you it's very difficult to describe it, but it's a very striking experience. And so I was struck by that, and so I kind of became obsessed, and I began researching as much as I could about it, trying to understand the system. And from there, my interest in philosophy came from two sources. One was I discovered what is now called IDR Labs, but at the time it was called Celebrity Types.
Okay.
Um, and it was a website which typed a lot of different historical figures. It was proposing typings for these figures, but among many of those figures were many philosophers, because the guy who created the site was very interested in philosophy. He was much more embedded in the traditional Western intellectual tradition than anybody else who I had seen working in this stuff online. It was someone who I don't know. I know a bit about his background. Ryan Smith was the fellow who created that website.
Okay.
And it was my looking at the philosophers on that site and being like, who are these guys? Like, I've heard these names, particularly the INFJ ones, and so I started, that sort of got me researching a little bit more in there. And then I took an undergraduate course which I thought was supposed to be an English writing course, like a composition course, but the
Yeah.
guy who was teaching it was trying to get I was at a smaller college, BYU Idaho, and he was trying to get a more substantial philosophy program started at that school. He was trying to improve it. So they had him teaching all these English classes. So he would fulfill all the requirements for the English class, but he would just make the subject of the class philosophy. so
Sneaky.
and yeah, and he did a wonderful job with it. It was a wonderful introduction to like the basics of philosophical thinking and critical thinking. He would have us do like thought experiments, and we would have to stand on one side of the room or the other depending on what we agreed on, and then we'd have to argue with each other. He would do all these, and then he would interrupt us while we were arguing and saying, "You have just formulated existentialism. You have just formulated utilitarian," and that's how he taught us these basic ideas. It was brilliant, and he was the right kind of guy to do it. It helped that he was kind of short, and he's never going to watch this. I could say he was ugly in a fascinating way, in my opinion, and he was short and argumentative, and so he was Socrates to me.
Yeah,
Looks
looks like a man with a story, basically.
Yes, yeah. Looked like a man, very much so. Jolly old guy. Great, really great guy. So anyway, yeah, and that sort of solidified, because up to that point, I had never realized that what I was interested in was philosophy.
Right.
That was, I had kind of had it in my head. Philosophy was this sort of dry, head in the clouds kind of subject over off to the side, and all the while, the very kind of thinking and that I had been doing was what philosophy is all about, where you're trying to get down to the very depths of things and trying to be always thinking ahead of what other people are thinking. And yeah, once I was in that class on the first day, once I realized that's what was going on, I was like, I have a name for what I've been doing this whole time, and that's philosophy. And then it connected in with typology immediately, because I could then look at philosophers and I could connect, assuming that they are this type, I can connect in concepts from Jungian psychology directly into different philosophers and compare and contrast them with each other, etc. So,
well, let me ask you, do you think, I always wonder this, do you think psychology or philosophy is the widest application? I go back and forth because there's an argument to be like, at first I would always think philosophy. It's like the broadest thing almost by definition. But then we're humans. We're stuck in human bodies with certain genetics, certain psychologies, and it's almost like the philosophy we can contemplate is almost determined a little bit by our human condition, thus making psychology the actual like first source of contemplate, like the contemplative paradigm, so to speak. What do you think about that chicken and egg thing?
Yeah, well, I have thought a little bit about that. My answer is almost more of a what's the right way of putting it? I had it a moment ago. It would be that for philosophy, for me, I think of it as like, it's almost by definition, whatever subject you're doing, the ground level will be the philosophy of that subject. It's the ideas that underlie what you're doing and are presupposed for whatever it is that you're doing. So almost just sort of as a definitional thing, I would always place philosophy at the bottom, even if as sort of the activity that you're doing to try to figure things out, even if the philosophy that starts to come out as the most true or the best for describing what we're trying to do, even if it turns out to be a very psychological philosophy, I would still, just as a definitional thing, call it philosophy. But that's sort of a separate issue. That's more of just a categorization issue. And that's separate from what you're really proposing, which is, to what extent does our psychology limit or allow for the kind of philosophical thinking that we do? Is that even a useful question, et cetera, et cetera? I don't know if that that quite answers what you're.
No, yeah, I get it. It's kind of a nuanced issue. And I have your book here.
Oh, you got my book! Yay!
Yeah,
You
yeah.
got a print copy. I'm so happy.
Oh yeah, I can't.
What have you thought of it?
I underline in it as well.
Yay! That is my dream, to have people underline my book. If you have my book, you should underline your favorite passages, because that will make, every time you do that, I feel happy. I'm sure that's what that's how that works.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Some people they see that and they're like, ugh, but I'm like, it's like a conversation. Like, what good is a book if I can't interact with it fully? This is like, it's like a documentation of our back and forth with one another.
Yes. It's very good. I can't even process the information unless I'm able to. I mean, I can, but I can't really use library books anymore because I can't write in them. If I can't write
I
in
hear
them,
you. Yeah.
I won't even. It'll go in one ear and out the other. I won't really apprehend it.
Well, I
Anyway.
bring that up because in the book you talk like, I actually had trouble, like, is he doing psychology or philosophy in this book?
If only I knew. No, I freely accept that I don't know which one I'm doing. It's sort of a weird, the term I've used so if you go to because you can actually search and find my the university that I'm at. I mean, if you type in Michael Pierce philosophy, it'll be like the first thing that comes up now. But I describe it as philosophy of personality theory. That was the best I could come up with. There's probably a fancier term someone might do. Yeah,
that's fair. I think you can put the words philosophy of in front of anything and get away with it, So it's okay in my book. I got a question for you.
Yes.
So it's good that I have a question, being that this is an interview. Happy coincidence there. But so how arrogant and cocky is it of us to talk of this thing called a personality, right? As if, it's a thing, like the hubris. So I'm thinking, like, on the day to day, I go to my 9 to 5, I look around, I live my life, yeah, I have a personality, but dwelling on it isn't really going to get me anywhere. I'm playing devil's advocate here. Like, what's the use? Like, why delve into all this stuff? Like, what, and is there even what we call a personality, or is it just an adaptation to our environment and not really anything deeper than that?
Interesting. Well, so a couple of things.
Mm-hmm.
The first would be, what is the use of this? On the face of it, that's a fairly easy question, I think, for me to answer, which is that it allows you to understand people on a deeper level. As I say in the introduction to the book, that's kind of the main thing I try to get across, is what it really means that other people don't think like you. It opens the world to you in a way when you really understand what the concepts that I'm trying to get at, and that other enthusiasts and typologists are trying to get at. You suddenly realize that there are other ways of thinking that are just as valid as yours. That sounds very trite these days. People will say that, but typology provides access for you to actually understand what that really means, and for it to actually have meaning and not just be sort of a trite saying of, oh, we should all just get along. Yeah, but that you can say that, but have you, how's that going for you?
Right.
If you don't truly understand. And the other thing is that, at least in my approach to the theory, the more that you understand other personalities, the more you will understand your own personality. Because in some sense, what what Jung would say is that one of the main causes of our conflict is projection, where you project something that you don't like about yourself onto another person, and you fight the other person as a way of fighting with yourself.
Yeah.
We do this with our shadow, right? We
Right.
have our shadow side, the parts of ourselves that we don't like, and so we have repressed, but they come out in us seeing that in other people. And sometimes the person doesn't even have the qualities, but we just project it onto them for some reason. I think the exact same model happens with typology, where the way that the system works is you have a dominant function, and the dominant function naturally represses its opposite function, because it's all of the functions are sort of opposite to each other, like a
Right.
color wheel or something. And so people will naturally, what they'll do is they will project onto other people their own parts of their psyche, these functions that they have not developed very well. They will be very sensitive to other people demonstrating those functions, and will not get along with them for it, or will attack them for it.
So
I
what
could
you're
try to give
saying?
a more concrete example, but sorry, you go. Sorry.
Oh no, I interrupted. Just to like, what I'm hearing is understanding maybe the nature of our projections helps our relationships.
Yes.
And if you want good relationships, it means that studying personality is valuable because
Yes.
it helps you don't know what you don't know, and it increases your awareness. And with that awareness, you can then make choices you previously couldn't have.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And you also, yeah, you'll be able to make choices you wouldn't have. You'll be able to, so I'll give you an example. I remember when I was first getting into typology, I began reading Emerson
Okay.
around that time as well. I started reading Ralph Waldo Emerson, and I remember getting very frustrated with him, because in my mind it seemed so clear, because he was emphasizing individuality. He was emphasizing the need for individualism and finding your own way and path. And my reading this, I was like, you fool. Because I was like, what do you mean? Like, if everybody chooses their own path, it'll just be chaos, right? This is just so obvious to me. Is like, no, you have to, there has to be some level of you conforming or unifying with other people. You have to give up of yourself for the sake of other people if you just do your own thing. And I remember just getting really frustrated with him, like, how could he possibly think like this? And you know and then all of a sudden it hit me what I had been studying in typology is, you have, among other concepts, you have extroverted feeling and you have introverted feeling. These are
Hmm.
two of many concepts. Extroverted feeling is one of the main manifestations, is this desire for everybody to get on the same wavelength in terms of their feeling,
Right.
to quote extrovert it, so that it's all out there, objectified for everybody. Introverted feeling is about the individual subject and about what they are feeling and what their ethics and needs are. And once I realized that, and I should say that as I've gotten more sophisticated in my understanding, I don't know for sure if Emerson is in fact an FI type. It gets very complicated of how people express their functions. But what was important for me was prior to that, it was like I was incapable of even considering that someone could, not only that someone could think differently, because in some sense the unconscious thought was, he must think like me. So if he's not coming to the conclusions I'm coming to, it's because he's an idiot. Or more often he's evil, or he has something that he's not admitting, right? And he wants to go and do evil things, and that's why I feel like a lot of people draw those sorts of conclusions where they assume someone is morally inferior or there's something
Right.
wrong with them, and that's why they're coming to these conclusions, when really it may be that they are actually seeing something that you have rejected in yourself, because around the
Right.
same time I was I was struggling with some repressions of my own that
Right.
I was not really acknowledging, and I've since integrated elements of Emerson's philosophy and figured out how those are to be better mixed with what I was already good at to become
Right.
a more whole person, you know.
Yeah,
Um,
that reminds me, in season one of this channel, I read a magnificent book called Archetypes, A Natural History of the Self by Dr. Anthony Stevens.
yes, I have that book. I haven't watched your videos on it, but when I saw that you had mentioned you had done some work on it, and I was like, someone else knows what this book is. I didn't realize anyone else had. I found it's one of my many acquisitions from a used bookstore. So I was very excited. But anyway, continue.
Yeah, literally every page of that book is like an atomic bomb level idea.
Yeah,
Uh, I
it's
just,
fantastic.
I'm completely in love with that man, intellectually. Um, he's just, his insights are brilliant. His writing is clear.
Yes.
Uh, it just like it's the dream. It's the perfect, like it's what you want when you study something, like
Yes.
clarity of idea, but also potency of idea. And but anyway, I bring that up because one of the many great things I got from it was it told us that, he said to play a game when looking at your shadow called play a game called Who Do I Hate the Most? I thought that was
Yes.
a funny way of putting it, but you start like articulating qualities, and that can be the beginning of increased awareness and what's called shadow work, which sounds new agey and probably turns more people off in the mainstream than on. But that's what shadow work is. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it's making the, I mean, the cliche is making the unconscious conscious. I mean,
Yeah.
that's literally what it is, but what it amounts to is an increase in awareness. It makes you aware of why you are doing things, why others are doing things, and that there's almost a moral responsibility that's maybe a little farther downstream. But the more you do that kind of work, the more awareness you have. Again, we already talked about this. It's going to increase the value of your relationships and the decisions you'll be able to make that previously you were blind to and maybe others were blind to. Maybe you're no longer taking offense because you understand what a projection is. And maybe that has rippling effects that, trickles out to your entire social network, and you don't really know what the effects of bettering your relationships will be, but you don't have to know like for it to be a good idea. Like
Yeah.
you don't know you can't see you might not be able to see the full positive impact as you trickle out as a force of positivity, and that's the value of shadow work. And I want to lead into another question, which is, you can't fully eliminate the shadow, can you? Or can you? What,
Oh, eliminate the shadow.
like, can
Um,
you become the ultimate like being and like have full transparency and self-knowledge and nothing's hidden from you?
well, I can't speak for all Jungian analysts, and I'm certainly not a trained Jungian analyst. I'm a hobbyist and enthusiast. But I mean, my own belief, and I believe it accords with what Jung would say, is that is not the goal. That is almost a misunderstanding of what's going on. The shadow, at least as I understand it, represents, and I see this in typology theory, at least as I've tried to lay it out, it doesn't represent something that is actually evil in itself.
Right.
It represents that which has become evil because you have not figured out how to integrate it. So it's
I'm gonna be rude and interrupt you real quick.
sure, sure.
In my video on the shadow, I call it a blunt secret admirer.
That's a very interesting way of putting it. Do you care to elaborate on that actually?
Well, it's
Um,
like it doesn't make itself known, so it's a secret. But
right,
it actually is rooting for you. The shadow, more than anything, wants to become conscious. And that's why
right.
it comes out in behavior. It wants to make itself manifest. It wants all of you. but
Yes.
and it's only held back by your ego, and which is the mediator, as far as I understand it.
Right.
And your ego can be weak or strong, which is in the case that it's weak. My understanding is that you have a high shadow possession, but if you have a strong ego, you have a low shadow possession.
Yeah.
But I think to add on to what we were saying, I think it's like perfect health. Nobody can ever be perfectly healthy. Does that mean you
Right.
shouldn't eat right or exercise ever? No.
Right.
It's more about the aim. It's more about the practice of it, of doing it, of doing shadow work and self-monitoring. That is this projection monitor, like some, that's where the term self-awareness, like having that inner kind of security force, like, was that a shadow possession? This sounds like corny language when I say it like this, but
Sure.
everyday people, should be like, this is a tool anybody can use. Like, why did I get angry? Like, have you ever said something you regretted 5 seconds? Like, why did I do that? It's in those moments that are giving you opportunities of self-knowledge. If you can only stop for a moment and explore them, what do you think?
Oh yeah. No. It's I mean, where my mind goes, and I apologize if this doesn't directly correlate with what you.
No problem.
It's a different aspect of it. Is that the idea of I view it. Sorry, I apologize. I lost my train of thought. Um,
No problem.
how's my voice coming through? By the way, I confess I've become very self-conscious about that all of
Oh, I
now.
I,
Is
uh,
it?
I threw a monkey wrench at you.
Is
So
it?
far, it's been good since we addressed it first.
Okay. Okay.
If it'll
Just want
make you feel better, if it gets bad, I'll type the word Mike in the chat, MIC,
Oh, okay.
and
Here,
just
I
like
will.
as a little alert that something got muffled.
Oh, perfect. 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 I will keep that chat open, and that will make me feel better.
Sure.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
But yeah, I'm very big on the idea of being able to integrate that energy in. Um, this is a weird um, image to bring in, but are you familiar with a video game called Little Nightmares 2? Have you ever heard of that?
Repeat that. What was that?
Little Nightmares 2?
No.
Okay. It's a weird little game. It's you can get it on Steam if you are so interested. I'm hoping to do a playthrough of it because there's a lot of symbolism in it that I think is actually very Jungian.
Okay.
And one of the things that happens is you're this little boy character, and there's this section where you are being chased by this very tall man in like a dark suit, right? Kind of
Right.
like a Slender Man figure, but with like a fedora, and he's just walking slowly after you. It's interesting because you release him when you go down this. You enter through this portal, which is like you entering into the unconscious. You go down this long hallway, and then you open this door that has an eye on it, and then he's sitting in a chair in the room, and then he gets up and starts chasing you, and then he chases you through this world, and then it culminates in this. The character that you play as wears this bag over his head through the
Okay.
whole game, which sort of represents this like shame, as though he's hiding his identity. But then when he faces off against this tall man, he takes the bag off in order to fight him. And you learn later that this is because the tall man is in fact a the way I interpret it is it is a version of the boy's future. It's what the boy could grow up to be and turn into. So it's like a shadow self. And the boy has to fight with the shadow self, but the only way he can fight the shadow self is by integrating it into him, by accepting who he is, by taking the bag off of his head. And that, I know that's a weird symbolism, and I'm throwing like a bunch at you about this weird video game, but I've been thinking about it a lot, because what happens is when you in order to defeat him, you actually effectively have to mimic his movements. You have to become a mirror image of him.
Okay.
And so sort of accept that energy into you. And once you do that, he loses the shadow power that he had over you and he fades away. And then you gain the power that he had
Right.
to manipulate the city and everything. So there's a lot of very Jungian symbolism of sort of dealing with the shadow. It's obviously that's a very antagonistic picture of it,
Yeah.
but it's it's very interesting.
Like,
So
so in a way, again, it's like a gift,
yes,
in a very roundabout way, but it doesn't look like a gift.
no,
And the thing is, the ego,
it's raw material that you
yeah,
have to.
the ego loves the way it is. And
Yes,
I talk about this in my answer to Job season right now, which is like we're going to talk about the archetype of the apocalypse soon, and what that really is it's that feeling of dread when you experience a change, and to the degree that you feel the dread means that there's a lot of archetypal archetype of the apocalypse in your shadow, like you're very living on the edge,
right,
you're very shadow possessed, but when reality changes, your reality changes, your mind can't handle it, and there can be psychotic breaks and all that. But
right,
my point is, the like you're either you either integrate your shadow or it has control over you. There is, I
right,
think the more I read about all this stuff, it's very binary. Like you are either being possessed right now by it in some way, which I am, and probably you are, and everyone watching this is in some way. Um, but you've also probably integrated a few things throughout life and increased your awareness. Maybe not using all these, $10 Jungian words, but you could call it experience, you could call it street smarts, whatever. But it's a psychic energy that wants to be with you. It almost like wants to make a bargain so that it can live life consciously as what like the ego is.
right,
It's almost envious, you know. But the ego loves it hates change. It
right,
it's like homeostasis. It doesn't want to change. Change is hard, and change feels like death to the ego.
right,
So, we connect all this imagery with the shadow that it's this dark, malevolent thing. But that's just the ego like begging you, please don't change. I'm happy resting where I am.
right.
Um,
Even when you're clearly, in some sense, you could argue that the shadow puts pressure on you by simply being there, so that it's a fascinating thing seeing people who clearly are not happy and they know they're not happy and they will pine after things being better, but they don't want to do anything. In fact,
right.
they will resist desperately anything trying to make them change in order to improve, because they would be like a kind of death. Even though they are miserable, they feel like it would be better to just stay being miserable in the way that I know than
Right.
to face the unknown, and to face the shadow effectively in order to get some experience from the shadow, from the
Yeah.
unconscious in general.
So two things on that that came to mind. One is that you mentioned some alchemy in your book here
I
and
mentioned a lot of things, but yes,
there.
I've become fairly familiar with partly
It's
through Jung and stuff. But
in a far future season. I've already read like 10 books on alchemy. I'm like in love with alchemy right
hmm
now.
hmm
And do you know what the Negredo is?
I do, I
Okay.
do.
So what you just said about like the people like kind of so down that they can't see a light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah,
That reminds me of the Negredo. And I don't
yeah,
know if you know James Hillman.
I do. I
Okay.
haven't read much of his work, but I know who you're talking about. Yes.
His work on alchemy is fantastic.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
it's a bit of an acquired taste. His writing style is like jazz. It's a little all over the place, so it took some
Okay.
getting used to. But once you get it, it's worth it. So take it from me for
Okay.
whatever that's worth. Um, but I think he said, and I might be wrong about this, but he said like the way actually through the Negredo is to go through what he calls the blacker than black. It's to like in alchemy, the fire is a big symbol, and like alchemists cook things,
Mhm.
and they cook things, and he said to apply a lot of fire to the Negredo to eventually, that's how you get out of it. You actually get out of the depression by getting as depressed as you possibly can,
Right.
basically. And at that, like another way of saying it is you got to hit rock bottom, you know? So it kind of like in that vein, you kind of like go deep and then end up out the other end. And typically you end up in the blue, which is like wetness. That's when you start actually being able to cry, and
Right.
you're feeling things again, you know, and that's progress from like the desert of blackness. That's the Negredo. You're just like in nothingness, and you know you're wallowing and you see nothing. But when you can actually feel like get the emotions coming through, you're transmuting that depression energy into the blue, into the wetness, which is being cooked. You're cooking your depression properly,
Right.
basically. Um,
Right.
that's what that reminded me of. And I have a season on alchemy coming in the far distant future, which I wish I could do, but I'm one humble man with a 9 to 5, and I can't freaking cover everything I want to. I know, you know, it's just anyway. I'm excited about it, but um, yeah, I, I want to ask, how do you think that where do you think in like the psychological architecture of like the ego, the subconscious, the conscious, the collective unconscious, where does like the typology reside? If I had to have a guess, it would be it's a analysis of the ego, like what's conscious. It lives at the ego level. But I want to hear your thought on that.
Yeah, I've thought a bit about this. When I was first studying it, it was almost, I took it apart from the other Jungian concepts. I was just studying the functions in sort of this more Myers-Briggs way, because they sort of separate out from Jung's other work. But and I play with this in the book. I don't make it super explicit, but I believe it's in chapter 5 where I talk about, I begin bringing in the unconscious more in full force as a way to uh, describe what an MBTI is, the function stack. So I believe there are analogies, at least. I'm not committed to any of them, but there are analogies to the idea of the person who has mastered all 8, because there's 8 functions. The person who has integrated all 8 of the functions, that would represent them having sort of become fully the self. They have integrated everything, but generally what happens is that would sort of be the union of the ego with the self, or sort of the coincidence of them. But as it stands, most people, the ego I would associate more with what a person's dominant functions are, the ones that they begin with and that they know. And then as you descend into unconsciousness and approach the shadow, you would find the functions that are more repressed, or that are unknown, or that have not been dealt with. And so they would represent sort of the nascent aspects of the person that could eventually become the shadow, or sorry, the self for them, as they were to, if that makes sense, integrate them in.
So if I'm understanding it, it's kind of like it's got 1 foot in the ego and 1 foot in the unconscious, and
Yes.
in the sense that like if you in a way, if you know your type, you know your shadow.
Yes, that would be the ideal. Yeah,
Okay.
you would, at least you would know your shadow from the perspective of personality theory, and whatever limitations that may turn out to have. How's the mic now?
Better.
It's better. Okay, I'll try to hold it here. Um, Yeah, so and I suppose I could try to go into more detail about the specifics, but yeah, I believe the general terms are you could I believe there are analogies that can be drawn. Um, but my observation of people, I've found more and more that you can often, one of the best ways to type people, or one of the ways that really kind of feels more surefire, is not so much determining what their dominant functions are, which is what you would think would be the best way, but
Yeah.
sometimes that can get sort of fuzzy because people have integrated themselves into society, and so they're not always showing their things can get blurry, and so one way to identify what type of person may be, in order to help them, is actually to determine effectively what their shadow is, which is to figure out what is the thing that really bugs them, that
Yeah.
really gets to them, and that they can't quite describe. That's when I know something personality typology related, is when either with myself or with another person, somebody else does something and you're just like, I don't like that. And then I ask, why don't you like that? And they struggle to describe it because we don't have the language. Until you learn the typological language, you will not have the language to be able to describe it clearly. It will be very vague, and you'll be able to pin down, oh, well, he's just very proud, or he's just very this or that, and it never hits on the specific thing, unless you have the language provided by typology, and even then, it's not a perfect thing. But where was I going with that? Oh yeah, so effectively what you're doing is you're identifying them by getting a taste of what their shadow might be, or an aspect of their shadow, and that tells you what they are repressing or what they are not at home with,
Yeah.
and that can give you a much better feel for what type they are than actually looking at their dominant functions.
Yeah, that's interesting. I have that myself. As you were talking, I was thinking like, ironically, I always wonder like, there's the type of personality out there that's like prone to roll their eyes at saying there's any kind of self-awareness at all. Like, it's like they're too salt of the earth.
Yes,
Like,
that
stop
would.
with this internal mumbo jumbo. Let me just get a wrench and, like, that's real intelligence, not any of
Right,
this like
yes.
psychology stuff. Um,
Yep.
I always wonder, like, yeah, whenever it's not usually that exaggerated, but there's an attitude noticeable to me.
Yes. So in the typology system, the neo-Jungian system that I'm using, um, uh, that would be the ESTP and the ESTJ. And the EST, so the interesting thing about the ESTP, so both of those would be likely to have that attitude. The ESTJ much more, but
Okay.
it's not as obvious with the ESTJ at first. So the interesting thing that happens is, so the ESTP has all the same functions as you, but they're in reverse order. The dominant functions, I should say, but they are in reverse order. So the ESTP at first will seem to be very directly contrary to you. They are much more likely to be like, "What is this crap?" Right? Like, what are you? This isn't real life stuff, right? Like, you're in the NI mode, is what we'd say, but I'm in the SC mode where real life is happening, and I want, give me the answers quick. Like, tell me
Yeah.
why this matters. What's the point here? Like, get to the point. And that's very frustrating at first, right? Because you feel very threatened because it's their SE, which is your most immediately repressed function, coming right at you and telling you you're not up to snuff.
Yeah.
But when the principle is that, although it will at first be very aggravating, you're much more likely, as you get to know the ESTP, to form a very good symbiotic relationship because you understand each other on a deeper level, and you threaten them just as much as they threaten you. Where the much deeper problems will arise are not as obvious, and that's with the ESTJ. So the thing about the ESTP is, although they're likely to maybe make you feel threatened, they are. I should taper that back a bit, because my experience with ESTPs is they are actually very philosophical by nature. They may not consider themselves to be, but particularly as they get older, I think there are a couple. Oh, this is a weird example to bring up because I don't actually care for him. But
Go for it, man.
are you familiar with Aleister Crowley, the esoteric guy?
Very, very vaguely. I
Yeah,
know he had involvement in tarot.
yeah, he was involved in a lot of things. He's like a major esoteric figure. He's been associated. People have accused him of like Satanism and stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, very controversial figure. I bring him up because, and it's not like I'm an expert either. I haven't read anything he's written, but my impression from learning about his biography is that many people type him as INFJ, and I think they assume, well, he's this esotericist guy, like he's like got all these big ideas, and he's doing all this stuff, and so he must be an INFJ or at least an INTJ. And I look at him and I'm like, no, he's an ESTP. He it fits much better. Um, to viewers who are more familiar with typology, this will probably make more immediate sense to you what I'm saying. But anyway, the point being that ESTJ is not going to have that side at all. ESTP, you could meet like a Crowley and you could talk all day long, like about esoteric stuff or philosophy or whatever, and they'll have a very complementary perspective. But it's the ESTJ who is, in some sense, the I don't mean this literally as though there really are two shadows, but that's where you get much deeper,
Mm-hmm.
because they directly repress the functions that are the most important to you, which would be NI, mainly NI. And yeah, that is where the salt of the earth, too much salt of the earth, as you said, that's such a great way of putting it from the INFJ perspective, where it's like, um, I want facts, and I want the tried and true. I don't want anything shiny. I want things to be normal, and I don't want to do all this highfalutin philosophical stuff. But the interesting thing is, I think INFJs are much more likely at first to get along perfectly fine with the ESTJ and be like, oh, I can work with this guy. It's
Yeah.
only when you really start to work with them, like say if you got married to one, then you would probably start running into much deeper problems than you would with, say, an ESTP. It's an interesting phenomenon I've observed a little bit. I don't know
Gotcha.
how much sense that makes, but
No, a lot, a lot. I have at least two questions on that.
yeah.
Um, Let me think. Which one I want to go for first? But I was thinking of you mentioned marriage,
Mm,
um, and also FYI for the viewer, salt is an alchemical thing as well. Like I love how like Gen Z gamers that they're using the word salty. It's coming back, but it's actually alchemical. So I'm like laughing that that alchemy is in our language and we don't even know
yeah,
it. For those who don't know, salt used to be more valuable than gold because it's the great preserver. It
right,
preserves things. So if you're salty, it doesn't mean you're angry. It means you're holding on. You're preserving the memory of being wronged. That's
right.
what salty really means. And when that clicked for me, I was like, "Oh my god, this is amazing!"
Uh-huh,
Like alchemy
uh-huh.
is like right under our nose. It's that awareness thing, increase of awareness. It's exciting. Anyway,
Mhm.
Hillman described in psychological salt mines, or sorry, salt licks. Animals go to them to get their salt, and they lick, and they
Right,
whenever they need it. But like us, some memories we hold on to, like revenge or something like that, and we go back and just like the animal, we lick and get that taste because
right,
we're preserving it. We're salty about it.
right.
Um, so that's what reminded me of that. Um, Also, and with the marriage, like, I think, there's a theory. I don't know how credible it is, but at least food for thought, that it's like the exotic is attractive, like what like opposites attract, right?
Yes.
That whole thing. And where that comes from is that I think genetically, the gene pool, the more varied it is, the more resistant to disease it can be. So
Hmm.
we're programmed to want to not. That's why there's an incest taboo. Like the bodies
Yes.
know if we're too similar, like of raw stuff. So we're like, oh, the exotic is erotic. That's the phrase I've heard.
Right.
So we can be attracted to people who are very different from us because subconsciously our bodies are telling us that this is key to survival in some way. And that's
Yeah.
what that reminded, like, again, this, like, it's like at a different level, but the same principle as shadow work. But it's like
Yes.
it's like shadow
Yes.
work at the genetic level. And
Yes.
for the viewer, when you read more and more Carl Jung, you'll start getting these like nuclear insights, and they line up. Like you can tell the strength of a principle that it applies the same way at multiple levels.
Mhm.
And that's what Jung is so like underrated, because he comes off as new agey and is dismissed, but and Freud actually I think has an even better reputation, even though it's not a good one, because he was focused on case studies.
Yes.
And they're like, oh, people are like, oh, well, these are actual studies, so obviously,
I think also his avowed materialism is much less threatening to people in this day
definitely,
and age.
definitely,
Whereas Young was, writing like the Red Book, where he's like, I'm talking to entities and stuff like this, and
right.
he writes a book on UFOs, and it's like because he's like, I'm just going to do what I want to do, and people feel very, regardless of the veracity of any of that, people feel
Yeah.
very threatened by it in our day and age.
So I wanted to like I have an excerpt from your book I wanted to
Oh yeah.
talk about. Um, you say, quote, "We must resort to a form of perspectivism, that is, a dialectic and dialogue that explores our human psychology from within it. We are like prisoners trapped in separate cells, collaborating through the walls on the prison's floor plan. I am more optimistic than Jung about our ability to describe each other." Um, and this reminded me of something I heard from Alan Watts, which actually almost stopped me from making the channel at all.
Oh
It's
really?
it's something that's haunted me whenever I think about all these topics, which is, and I'm sure he's not the first to say it, but this is where I heard it from first for me, which is that how is the self that needs improvement supposed to get improvement from that very same self? Like it's the who watches the Watchmen. Like,
Mhm.
aren't we so biased? Like, how can we even type ourselves? It's almost ridiculous, because like we almost live, we're like the heroes of our own mythology. We're biased to the ridiculous degree. Like, is self the lens is constructed from the very psyche you're viewing your own lens through. So like this haunted me. like
Right.
like I don't know how to escape that at the time. I have my answer, but that passage from your book about uh exploring human psychology from within it reminded me of that. I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah, well, what I was trying to get at with that was because I believe I end the introduction with that imagery, if I recall correctly. And the reason I did that was because I was trying to emphasize that my book cannot be the end all be all, if only just in terms of the type descriptions. I was basically, it's my disclaimer of I'm not claiming to have the whole truth, et cetera, et cetera. But it's deeper than that, because what I was trying to get at is a very real feeling of, okay, I'm in the INFJ cell, and curses. How's this?
Better.
Better? Okay. How's this? Is this like awkward, or is this
Uh,
okay?
that's right there sounds good to me so far. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And I assume you'll probably cut these little bits out if you, I mean, you can keep them in if you want to. I don't care. I operate on the principle that whatever I say can be used against me for
Well,
good or ill. So.
that's compatible with my radical, perhaps too much so, commitment to authenticity.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think we're in agreement from different angles there. So
So,
I'm
but I mean, if for aesthetic reasons you want to cut it out, either way, I don't care. But
thank you.
just yeah. So, well, good. I'm glad we're on the same page there. What was I talking about?
That
Oh,
pass, yeah,
yeah. I'm in the INFJ cell, as it were,
yeah,
and so I'm viewing things from in those terms, and then who knows how many other subdivisions there are from other systems and stuff. Um, but and then you have other cells, and each, we don't know how the cells are positioned in relationship to each other. We can't see it, but if we communicate with each other by like tapping on the walls and Morse code or calling out to each other or whatever, and we can deduce, at least to a certain extent, quite a bit with some creativity, what the arrangement of the entire prison is, and at least in terms of how we are connected with each other. Because if I know that so and so is that far away over there, and they know that I am the equal distance away from them over here, and
yeah,
then we know, as soon as you get three, you begin triangulating. And so I was trying to use that imagery to describe, okay, so you have my book, and I have my biases, which I've done my best to overcome. And that's the second part of it, which is, okay, well, how do you even overcome your own biases?
yeah,
How do you overcome that? Because if you have one person who's biased and another person who's biased, okay, you can have them have a conversation, but does that magically solve the problem that they're both biased? And to that, I mean, it's kind of the classic philosophical problem of skepticism, which my immediate reaction to is to say, what would be a good way of putting it? See, so when you were saying it, the first thing that cropped up in my head was maybe it's that we're just not a unity. We are a unity in one sense, but I think in order for actually psychology to work in some sense, you have to accept what Jung and ultimately Freud, and he was drawing from philosophers before him, have submitted, which is that there's different parts of us that have a certain independence of each other, and somehow that overcomes the problem. As I'm saying it, I'm realizing it's a little more fuzzy than I thought it was, but you might know where I'm going with it. At the very least, Jung, I feel like, would say, well, you have your own ego, and then you have the unconscious, and those are not the same thing. And so you can, I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah,
yeah.
I don't know. I
It's a
fizzled
tough.
out there.
It's a tough one. My answer is kind of long, but
Okay.
if I can try and be brief, uh, the more I think archetypes actually help with this, because I think the whole reason I fell in love with archetypes is because I saw it as a tool you can use to kind of break your biases. Now, why
Ah,
is that? Because archetypes are historical. They arise out of the collective unconscious. Every human who's ever lived, every human culture, whether it be like the warrior archetype who allows us to get the energy to move the rock that's blocking water we need, or finish that pile of paperwork, um, we can tap into something, our psychic lineage
right.
of what's called the warrior archetype, to get that energy. But when you study the warrior archetype, it has shadow possessions. So you can become uh, like like a warmonger, like a soldier who can't turn it off. You know,
Right.
like just give me the next mission. Like their whole life is a train wreck. But if they get a mission, like they're just on go mode. They don't.
Right.
This is why berserkers, like the Vikings, they do that dance. Why? They're summoning that warrior archetype. They want to be shadow possessed.
Right.
Archetypes are an insane source of psychic power. But if you fly too close to the archetype, you get possessed by it and it wreaks havoc on others. So in the same, but you want that if you're a berserker, and that shows the wisdom they had. And coming back from battle, they had to be isolated from the rest of the village so that they could like decompress. And the
Right.
village knew this. Like you do not bring them in, because they will psychologically contaminate everything.
Right.
They understood that. And almost because it was more primitive, it was more obvious and concrete.
Right.
Now, you're never going to see that in that way as obvious in probably our day and age, but that happens all the time. With
Right.
what do you think workaholism is? And I'm saying this to the viewer, like
Right.
it manifests in other ways. Now, because these archetypes are from the collective unconscious, they're from all of us. They give a more decentralized perspective so that when you engage in a sort of shadow work, you have like all of humanity has given you the tools to use for your self-awareness. It's almost like they're all our brothers and sisters, and they all
Yeah.
this great tool for us to the historical meaning gives fuel for our personal meaning if we can
Right.
apply it and have the discretion. And just like a tool has to be learned, it has to be mastered, but it's worth it for the increase of awareness and the value that brings, which we talked about earlier. That's why I kind of fell in love with archetypes. That was my answer to the Alan Watts conundrum. That
Yeah.
if we engage with archetypes, we're no longer, we may be the ones operating the wrench or whatever, but the wrench is special because it's historical and not personal. So that was a
Yeah.
big speech.
No. I dig it. I dig it. It's very very Jungian,
Yeah,
obviously, because it's the collective unconscious. But yeah, interesting. Uh,
I wanted to. We'll probably come back to that, but I want to throw another thing at you if you don't
sure,
mind.
sure.
So when I was young, I told you we'd come back to this, but when I was younger, I took that typology test for the first time and got INFJ.
Yeah.
But I took it like in my later life at some point, and I got ENFJ. And
Okay.
then I took it right in preparation for this interview, and I got ENFP. And so
Yeah,
there's a
that's the
couple of things.
internal problem with the tests. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I want to kind of get into. So, people are like, oh, find out what Hogwarts house you're in. Let's
Oh,
take this
yeah,
test.
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
how is that sort of thing? But on the other hand, Jordan Peterson has gotten famous for his like Big Five personality test, and
Hmm.
there's the Enneagram and all
Hmm.
that. Like, we're like, how do you consolidate all that, and what's your perspective on Jungian typology versus all that stuff?
Yeah. So, the first note would be: did you take them all from the same place?
I did not.
You did? Okay, yeah. So, I mean, that would obviously be the first thing. Is I don't know uh, how they're measuring the different questions or what's going
Right.
on behind the scenes. But that being said, even taking it from the same place, people will complain about getting different types, and I just see that as a necessary artifact of the fact that well, did you answer all the questions in the exact same way? If
Right.
you didn't, then yeah, your mood changes, and it's kind of there was an interesting and this is also just kind of a problem with self-answer tests in general, which I'm not saying this to knock the test because I think they're extraordinarily useful practically. But somebody, as a joke, they took a potato and they put it next to the computer. And this was basically effectively they just didn't answer any of the, like they only answered like one way for all of the questions on this thing, and then it got one of the types. It was like INFP or something, and they're like, INFPs are
Of course,
potatoes.
the potato would be an INFP. Of course
Yeah,
it would. Yeah.
it was something like this. It was like, so clearly that we have discovered how the test is weighted.
Right.
Right. But I only mention that as just sort of it's part of the problem. But that all being said, when taken in good faith, ideally, it's an indicator. It can point you in the right direction. I was going someplace with this. Oh yes. So that all being said, so let's talk about the big five.
Sure.
I actually made a series of videos where I was critiquing the big five, though uh, I hesitate to say critique. I mean, that's definitely what I was doing because I was sort of fed up at the time of people saying the big five is the more scientific one, and is better than, because I hear that all the time. But the biggest thing about the big five for me, especially now, is that it's basically the MBTI. The concepts in it fit in very nicely with the MBTI concepts. The only difference is neuroticism, which has, which I actually think is the weakest element in the big five. But agreeableness lines up with feeling. Conscientiousness lines up with the judgment axis. Openness with intuition. And then extroversion, introversion is literally the same thing. They just use the same terminology. So
Right.
I view the success of the big five as being sort of a bolstering of the success of at least the concepts of the MBTI. And it's like, okay, if it's more successful in these, according to certain metrics, then that's just because they figured out a more robust way to test for these things. But I view it as a radical independent confirmation of what Myers and Briggs came up with, which is directly from Jung. So it's a confirmation of Jung's four functions and the concepts he came up with. The Enneagram is totally its own thing. As far as I can tell, it is it does not link up with the MBTI system, if only simply because the Enneagram has 9 types, and you can't really map 9 onto 4. It's like odd, even. And so it doesn't really, there's definitely like clusterings of like certain MBTI types are more likely to relate to certain Enneagram types,
Yeah.
but it does seem to be very much its own sort of thing. And I am not nearly as familiar with the Enneagram as I am with MBTI, but it's not like I hold a grudge against anybody for using any other personality system. Now, I
Right.
feel like there's a deeper point to your question that I'm sort of skirting the surface of.
Well,
Um,
there's a few. I mean, hopefully, there's a lot of ways, a lot of unpacking to do with each one. We could talk
sure.
forever if we unpacked every aspect of it. Um, I'm curious about a lot of things. Like, what to you is like the best place people can go to get typed?
Yeah, I get asked that a lot too.
Yeah.
Uh, and I don't have a super confident answer, unfortunately.
And
Um,
unfortunately, in turn, that makes people skeptical of the whole thing,
right, right.
which is
Um,
sad. Um,
yeah, it's interesting because in my mind, I'm like, I don't want to say it irritated. I had this immediate response of being like, well, get over it. But but what I mean by that, it's like my shadow coming out or something. What I mean by that is for me and a lot of other people, the type indicators are useful, but it's just an expression of the ideas underneath it. And so if you can learn the ideas,
yeah.
ideally you would be able to identify, I get that, and I don't get that. So I'm probably more like over here.
May I hit you with a radical theory?
Please do.
So when I was reading your stuff and combined with all the other reading I've been doing, I had this wild epiphany. Um, and it's an epiphany I had before, and I have a video called a Defense of the New Age.
Oh, I think I saw the thumbnails for that. Yeah.
Gotcha. Well, in it, it reminded me kind of what I talked about in that video. And when I had the idea, I was like blown away, just like overcome with it. Like Hegel says, "There's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come." I love that
Ah,
quote. But this is like, okay, so enough build up, Justin. Okay, what's the thing? Um, my thought was this: tarot, MBTI, alchemy, I Ching, Big Five, Enneagram. What is it really? What's going on? Okay, here's what's happening. What's happening is you are something, and you are receiving a certain stimulus that audaciously asserts that it has knowledge of your inner workings in some way. Um, and then you have a response to it. Now, you boil that down and you put it in the Jungian form. What it is, it's methodological projection. It is a willful.
okay.
It's a
I think I know where you're
willful
going with this.
artificial projection. You are forcing yourself to project in a certain moment, whether it be tarot, crystals, whatever. You are
Yeah,
receiving something, palm reading. Oh, fortune tellers don't know anything, whatever. Well, think about it. That's not the important part. It's your response, your
right,
reaction. Are you going to use that moment for increased awareness? Or are you going to roll your eyes and say it's nothing but new age nonsense? Are
right.
you going to actually try it on and say, like, what if this were true? Are you going to use it or not? This is, I think, the power of all of this, of MBTI. People might say, oh, yeah, well, if I was in a certain mood and it came out this way, but then I was in a different mood and it came out that way, that's the most unscientific thing ever. So why even bother if I'm just going to be something else in get another moment? Well, it's not about the result, like you were saying. It's about your masochistically submitting yourself to a
Right,
certain structured projection. And you, if you are wise, you will read what it says and you will explore that moment of projection that has been constructed for you in a system that's
right.
designed to have a certain uh, environment of possibility, depending on
It's
whether it's Big Five or Enneagram or whatever.
right,
What do you
right.
think about that?
No, well, see, what strikes me about that is one of my earlier videos was I was trying to address the problem of, and it's been a prevalent problem where people, excuse me, are very into typology, but they have a great deal of doubt about their own type. They don't feel comfortable committing to anything. They don't, for whatever reason, they didn't have that original experience that I had, where it was like, that's it. Um, I've got it. I've got my central point, and I can figure everything out from there. Um, and I remember having just kind of the odd idea that I expressed in that, in I think it's the third video. There are three videos. Um, where it was in a lot of ways what you're saying, where I said, um, the ultimate best advice I can give is, and I don't, in some sense, I was kind of going off of a kind of inspiration for this, like in just sort of the sense of this is an idea that occurred to me of an attempt of a solution. Was I just said, just the one way to solve this is to say, all right, well, take one of the tests, take the answer, and roll with it, and just assume that's the type. And what you're going to do is you're going to roll with it until enough contradictions and enough, see how it works, get it to see if it works for you and if it helps you to understand yourself and other people. And because it almost certainly will if you're creative enough at first. And then the question is, but is it going to stand the test of time? Is it going to really continue to work? And I was like, hold on to it until enough contradictions begin accruing that you're like, I don't think this is the right type. And then you have a better idea of where you actually might fall and where you're more comfortable. But it fits in with kind of what you're saying, because there's that element of what's more important is your own response to it.
Right.
And the you are, because that's one of the, I mean, this is kind of a problem in psychology generally, is the problem of projection,
Yeah.
of how do you determine something about somebody's psyche? We can determine things about their brain, but it's continually extremely difficult to determine things about the mind, because the only access we have to another person's mind is through self-reporting. They
Yeah.
have to tell us what's going on in their mind, and are they really the best expert to know what's going on in their own mind?
Right.
Or and it's amazing that we can get anywhere with psychology, with even though that is a constraint. So it's not just MBTI. This is a problem. I see this crop up a lot, by the way, in with a lot of mental illnesses and disorders and things, where it's a recurrent problem in the clinic,
Yeah.
um, where people will be diagnosed with things and they'll roll with it for a while, or they'll be like, I'm not so sure about that, but the psychologist will sort of push it on them, or really it I think I mentioned this in the Big Five video. The DSM, or the official manual for diet, it has very similar problems that the MBTI has.
Yeah.
The diagnosing mental illness, it's a very similar issue. How do you diagnose someone with a thing going on in their mind? Well,
Right.
I guess we'll create how do you do it objectively?
Right.
And MBTI and Jungian typology, because I feel like it's lower stakes in the immediate sense of like, okay, are you struggling with suicidal thoughts and stuff? If you are, you probably should go to the psychologist before you come to me, please, because I don't know if I can help you in an official way. But anyway, so it's lower stakes in that regard. But where was I going with that? I'm sorry. The Because it's lower stakes, I feel more free
Yeah.
to sort of do the more wishy-washy thing of being like,
Yeah.
well, let me give you the more philosophical explanation. What is the essence of this type, right? Which is hard to pin down, but I want, because if you're like in a clinic, you need a checklist.
Yeah.
You need to say, okay, do they have this symptom? Do they have this symptom? But it's fascinating seeing it, because it's like you can never do it mathematically with the mind, because it's
Yeah.
always going to be the fuzziness of the language, and the language will change what people, you can't go back to Freud's descriptions of hysteria or something and use that unless you get a really good grip on what he specifically meant when he was using some of these old timey terms. If that makes any sense. Anyway, that's my long ramble. I
Yeah, I hear that. I like the freedom, and archetypes are kind of the same way. I
Yeah,
think archetypes are a broad brush, and this is like more of a finer brush than the archetypes. They both have their uses for self awareness, and
yeah.
that's what the goal is, I think. And it's about wholeness. It's not about being better, or I'm a good person. Jung would hate that phrasing. Uh,
Oh
it's
yes, yes, he did.
it's more about being whole than being good, about being integrated, and that's what all this is for. That's what you're studying your subject for. That's why I'm studying archetypes. It's where we realize the value of being an integrated human, how that can better, people's lives, and people can take action right now and do this kind of work. That's, it's an incredible tool. The biggest punchline that I had when I articulated that defense for the new age thing, that the MBTI and all this it's like structured projection. It's almost like shadow work in a way.
Yeah.
Broadly speaking. But the real thing hit me when I combined it with alchemy, which has to do with materials and all this. It hit me that, okay, what I just described was a subject looking at something, getting a response, and having a reaction, which is an opportunity for self-awareness, right? That's what I just articulated. But isn't that all of life? Right now, as I'm talking to you, I'm hearing something, I'm having a response. Hell, I could look outside and see a cloud. It could, I had this epiphany that every moment of our lives is an opportunity for shadow work. Every moment of our lives is equal to taking an MBTI test in that way, because you're combining, you're connecting, and you have an opportunity to, something is having an effect on you and you are reacting to it in some way. Now, the advantage to tarot and MBTI and stuff is that it has a structure. It attempts to codify and bring clarity, whereas reality would be nebulous. However, it's kind of the same thing, isn't it? Isn't that what life is ultimately? That life is kind of a constant opportunity for self-awareness. Everything you look at, everything you experience, like is a test in a way, whether it be Big Five or whatever. It's just the test of reality,
Interesting.
So that's my defense of the new age. It's like people say crystals and I Ching, it's all nonsense, but you're missing the point. The point is, you're not supposed to get the result and then, I'm not going to look both ways when I cross the street.
Right.
It's your reaction. You might say, that's totally inaccurate. I'm not like that at all. Or are you? That's supposed to start the conversation, and that leads to, yet again, I'm repeating myself for good reason, increased self-awareness. Why did I say that wasn't like me? Now you've just gained self-awareness. Now your relationships will improve in that little bit of way, and in alchemy, Mary Louise von Franz, she's a Jungian, and she had kind of a similar observation that if you see like an avalanche in real life, like it's a momentous, intense thing that has an effect on you, that's an opportunity for, that's a deep, things have effects on you. In reality, we interpret them, and given that we do that, is almost evidence for what I'm saying, that you can look at it and you can dissect that moment of self-awareness, for lack of a better term. But that's what I wanted to share about the kind of like freedom you get from the MBTI, that it is so low stakes, but that's a feature, not a bug.
Right.
So to my viewers, don't worry about the result, is what we're saying. I think don't get so stuck on it. More think about why you agree with it, why you don't, and that might be more productive. What do you think about that?
So, I didn't know if you were going to have another question or something, so I wanted to hold off. No, yeah, it's very. See, I'm going to confess, this is the curse that is upon every Jungian typology analyst, is that sometimes I'll end up focusing more on the typology implications of what someone is saying about their type than I do about what they are saying.
Well, feel free to share that. I'm sure the viewers would be curious where your mind is going.
Well, so what struck me was, I feel bad because I'm not addressing what is clearly it is a very interesting point, and also clearly very important to you. So I'm sorry if I'm deflecting from it. But what's interesting is that so the emphasis on, so the reason I bring this up is because the truths that you are trying to articulate could be articulated in different languages, both in the obvious traditional sense that you could say those things in Spanish, or you could say them in Norwegian or something. But they could also be spoken in the metaphorical language of the different types. And you would focus, but it would be more radically different because you would be focusing on different things. And so this is not meant to mess with the truth of what you're saying, but it's interesting. It can help people to not get hung up on the particular way that you say it. So what struck me was the emphasis on like seeing an avalanche coming down, and this has this effect on you,
Right.
And almost like dropping something into a pond, and the pond ripples, right? And ripples in a pond. Introverted perceiving. So NI and SI are the two introverted perceiving functions, which it's introverted perceiving. An extroverted perceiving function is going outside of yourself to try to get experiences. Introverted perceiving is receiving in those experiences. So the notions of self-awareness remind me of, because I relate very much to this, the idea of going through all of life and receiving in these experiences and becoming aware of them and analyzing them. It's very natural to put things in that way. And then the ESTJ comes along and is like, what the frick are you talking about? Right? Like, what do you mean self-awareness? This is crap. Not because you're wrong, but because they don't recognize what you're getting at. And then they'll be talking about something and you'll be like, that's crap what you're talking about. But you could very well be saying the same thing ultimately. If you don't recognize that you are getting at these different sides of the same thing. That's what I was trying to get at with all of this. So that but anyway, the particular way that the truth has manifested itself to you, of focusing in on the I do find that very interesting, this idea of almost like the dialogue with the world. And that being, you're likening that to like a continually occurring test. It's a very interesting way of putting things that I don't have comments on yet because I'm chewing on it. You have dropped the stone into my pond, and it's going to take a while for it to reach the bottom.
That's what we hear at Ausgrave Royalty, which is just me, by the way. But I'm speaking for posterity. That's our goal.
The royal we.
Yeah, exactly. The proverbial. I just send up the flare and illuminate something, and it's for the people to chew on. So I did my channel justice just then. That's good to know.
You did.
I'm looking at my notes here. I had this. I think you might find this interesting. I noticed. I'm not familiar with this aspect of your work in quantum theory.
Oh yes.
But I have a note here that I of a question. I think we've already talked about it a little bit, but I'll run it by you. Is there kind of I take it you're familiar with the split screen experiment?
Yes, the double slit. Slit. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I think it's the same. Like hey, viewer, you want to know what a real horror movie is? Learn about that. In my opinion, that's what keeps me up at night. I'll link it below if I can find it, but there's like a cartoon video on YouTube. It's like it reminds me of the Jurassic Park, like Dino DNA. There's like one of those, but it describes the experiment. You want to know that is some horrifying shit. So I will link that below and give you nightmares if you really comprehend it. But what I'm trying to say is like the point of it was that particles, upon being observed, change their nature from a particle to a wave and vice versa.
Yeah.
Now, how freaking weird and horrifying is that? Like,
Yeah.
like I'm looking around my apartment and things are changing from particles to waves, or not. I mean, there's the quantum equations have already resolved it at the point of material matter. But anyway, I'm digressing. That was the point of the experiment. What I was going to ask about how it relates to typology is that, like, it's almost like when we give our attention to a designation, it changes us. So there's like a quantum effect there that when the type is observed and fixated upon, there's a sort of
Right.
change that takes place. Like, think about who you were and then who you were after you get your result. In that,
Right.
at least that 5 minutes, you're actually thinking about it afterwards. You're thinking, it's almost like there's been a change there.
Yeah. Well, I was talking with one of the dangers, and I was talking with my brother-in-law about this, is it can happen where it's something I don't think it's something you can overcome, and it's not a necessary thing, but it will often happen that when someone will uh, and it happens all the time in psychology, someone will get a diagnosis for something, and they will begin to act more like that diagnosis. They will begin to fulfill what it has proposed for them, which, I mean, that's kind of a general principle, right? Is that you will begin to act more like what you think other people think you are
It's
by
kind of
what
like
they tell
the
you.
placebo effect, right? And
Kind of, yeah.
that's a different thing, but similar to
It's a
what you're saying.
similar where there almost seem to be potent, it's like the mind body problem of like how's this
Yeah.
integrated together, we're plastic beings. But more on point with what you were saying, the notion of um I've made some videos about quantum theory. I have some interesting ideas about it that sort of shift from the norm, but specifically on the notion of the you know what, actually, do you mind repeating what specifically your question was, if anything? I
Well,
apologize.
no, it's fine. It was just, I think we already covered it, which is
Okay.
just basically how when you, like, the way a particle shifts to a wave upon being observed, there's like a change in our psyche upon observing and ingesting
Right.
the result from a test, you know?
Right. Well, yeah, in fact, and I have to make the preface that as I've done my best to try to study quantum theory from a philosophical perspective, um, I there's a lot of different interpretations of trying, and some of them involve consciousness, some of them try not to involve consciousness, and but that being said, there is a very interesting analogy. I think there's a lot of interesting analogies to be drawn between the behavior of quantum particles and the behavior of animals,
Hmm.
even like microscopic organisms and things. I'm not saying that's what quantum objects are. I'm just saying that I feel like the unpredictability and also that notion of you interact with it and it interacts back with you, which makes observing it very difficult. It's almost like you're having to do quantum psychology with
Right.
these things, which you don't want to take that too far, because you can run it, because there's some important strictures on the quantum realm, but there's you repeatedly in some of the tests, it becomes easier and easier to draw comparisons with human beings more than with the typical objects we know of in physics. One
Yeah.
example, I remember actually drawing this connection with typology, where there's one kind of experiment which it's almost like a class of experiments where effectively what you do is you perform a measurement on the quantum particle, and it's a whole other thing of what even that means. But you perform a measurement on a particle and you determine, okay, is it black or is it white? Obviously, particles are not literally black and white, but this is sort of a placeholder for a binary test that you perform upon the particle. And it goes through the test and it comes out of the black slit or something, right? So you've shown that it is a black particle. Great. And then it goes into the next test. And this test is meant to show, is it hard or soft? And it comes out of the soft part, right? And it's like, okay, great. So this is a black, soft particle. And you could connect this with Jungian typology, perhaps. You could say, oh, they've come out as a thinker and they've come out as extroverted or something like this. And then you're like, but I just want to make sure, because I'm kind of curious what'll happen. Let me put it through another black-white test. And so you put it through another black-white test, and this time it comes out white. And it's like, hold on, you don't get to change your answer, Mr. Particle. Now, and by the way, I should say that this is obviously very abstract, and I have a whole thing about the way that quantum physics is explained that obfuscates things. But you see where I'm going with this.
Yes. Yes.
This is a thing that does seem to happen, and the question is, why does it happen? But for our purposes, we don't even need to get into why. It seems to mimic what, if you imagined a bunch of like 2-year-olds going through this, and you're like, okay, you got to remember this, okay? You are INFJ. But then by the time they've gone through all these other tests, they've forgotten. And then you ask them again, and so they just make something up.
Right. Yeah.
Probabilistic at that point. But the interesting thing is say you put them through the test and it comes out white instead of black this time. And you're like, okay, so I guess the quantum system can change. But then you're like, well, let's put it through another black-white test. And it comes out white again. And you're like, okay, another black-white test, it comes out white again. And it will always, because it has been determined by that first test.
Yeah.
So now it is a white particle, and it will continue to be white as many tests as you do until you test it for hard soft again. And then it resets the black-white. It's as though it can only, and this is like a whole separate thing. I need to study it more to understand better how it integrates in with the rest of quantum physics, or it's possible that even there's some things in quantum physics that I feel like have just been misunderstood, but it's a really interesting idea, the notion that it can only be determined along one of its axes, and once it's determined on that axis, it's undetermined on the other one.
Yeah.
And you can only have it one way or the other, which fits in very nicely with certain typology theories. So I thought I would share that with you.
Yeah. That hits me right in the IQ.
You're welcome.
It just it's intimidating. Like quantum, I mean, it's all very complicated. Like you said, it's overwhelming.
I feel like it doesn't. Well, it does have to be right now, but I just think that's because we haven't come to understand it.
For sure.
I do believe we can. I disagree vehemently with those who say we will never understand quantum. I believe we can. We just haven't gotten there yet, and we're going to need to change some of the ways that we view the universe in a more. Everybody says that now, but none of them are radical enough for me.
Well, anyway. I'm glad you're an optimist on it. I am too. I mean, I think it's I hear about quantum entanglement, quantum computing. I think it's got an incredible amount of application. I'm optimistic about it, but I ain't going to be in that field. That's for sure.
That's what I'm writing. That's what I'm writing my graduate thesis on.
Oh,
my
okay.
Master's thesis. The interpretation of the double slit experiment.
Okay. Well, we'll talk about that maybe, hopefully, another time.
I'd be more than happy to.
Awesome. I'll take you up on that. I have one last question for you.
Alrighty.
I had a thought, and I wanted to get your response to it, how it strikes you.
42.
All right.
Sorry,
next question.
I couldn't resist. Okay.
No. That's I deserve it. So, what do you think about the following statement or the following perspective, that the more conscious you are, the more integrated you are, the harder it is for you to be typed consistently? because Jung said that people who are very conscious often look kind of a little nuts because they don't repress or hide anything. There's no
Right.
rug to sweep back into their shadow. So they have to deal with things in the foreground all the time.
Right.
And it's a it's almost like a terrible sales pitch for becoming integrated or individuated, which is like what's your prize for self-awareness? It's self-awareness. It means
Right.
that every problem you're going to know about, and you're going to have a thought about it, and you can't brush it away because you know how unhealthy that is, because it's almost you have more responsibility,
Right.
and with that
Right.
responsibility comes the power and hopefully incredible relationships. The problem is you now have a higher maintenance mode, and you may act a little off sometimes
Right.
because while you're fighting your battles, and in some ways you may act this way, in some ways you may act that way, but that's why you're doing it and you're volitional about it, but it can seem inconsistent from the outside, but that's just
Right.
because you've ingested so many different aspects of yourself that you're just rolling with it.
Right.
So what do you think about all that?
Yeah. The thoughts that arise for me is, as far as typing someone who is more integrated, I'm gonna need to think more about that. My immediate reaction is to say, uh, I almost want to be contrarian and say no. It would actually be easier to type them
Hey, be
because they
contrarian, be contrarian.
because it would be easier to type them because be, because if they've integrating the stack doesn't change the order of it, you become more your own person, and so the typology would still be reflected. I
Well,
don't know if that's actually the case,
if I
but
may,
sure.
to play devil's advocate, the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. So if
Ah,
you are if you do incredibly become and sink into your type, it means you have a gigantic shadow,
right.
which
Well,
is gonna
it,
destroy your life. So the
yeah.
theory goes in some way. So that was my thought about that. To play devil's
Yeah,
advocate.
yeah. Well, and I was thinking about the fact that earlier I said it's easier to type somebody often based on their shadow, which would contradict what I just said about once they're integrated, it's easier to type them. So I'm ambivalent, but what I will say, and this fits in, um, I think this is sort of my general feeling is I feel like in my life I have succeeded in integrating parts of myself, and the process for that is difficult. But I feel like sometimes, I will admit, sometimes I feel like Jung is actually too pessimistic about things. He's trying to be a realist. He's trying to be realistic, and I really appreciate that. But my own experience has been that things can turn out very well for people, even in the realm of psychology. I know he has that famous quote about, which I think is actually very profound and should not be swept aside, that the goal is not to become a good person, it's to become a whole person. I think that's very important, but I'm always going to say that becoming a whole person it's going to always be the same thing as becoming a truly good person, which is to be opposed to appearing to be a good person, according to the
Mm,
mores of the society that you're in.
I love
Because
that.
a good person in a given society is often going to all. One of the interesting things, actually, I think about society is that the ideal person posited by that society will always be pathological.
Oh,
If
I
you if
love
they
that so much, man. I love
right,
that. Yeah.
if you fully the person the most dangerous person in the society is the person who actually attempts to fully embody what the society is positing, because they will go crazy, and that's often precisely where some of the revolutionaries come from, or there are people who attempted to actually they eliminated all hypocrisy from themselves,
Yeah.
which everybody else has a certain level of hypocrisy in that society in
Yeah.
order to enable them to function. But if you try to eliminate that and actually become a truly good person according to the society, it it often breaks you and you go crazy. And then if it doesn't totally break you, then when you reintegrate yourself, some if you don't figure out how to fully integrate that, some people can become obsessed
Let
with
me
destroying that society.
rudely
Yeah, go
interrupt
ahead.
you yet again.
Go ahead.
This just reminds me so much of what I'm covering right now about the archetype of the apocalypse. And later in the season, we're talking about David Koresh and the Heaven's Gate cult, and how
Ah,
that's what happens when you become possessed by the archetype of the apocalypse. That's what it looks like.
right.
You think like you're a prophet because you mentioned the word pathological. It means that you're so far out on the edge that when the coin flips, it's horrifying. You get
Yes.
like
Yes.
people have gotten religious images and you have nightmares and hallucinations, and it's just you're overwhelmed, you know? And
Yes.
that's the archetype of the apocalypse possessing you. And like Koresh starting what he started in the compound and all that. Like um so I also wanted to say like what Michael is saying here, I think what I'm hearing, viewer, is like think about an our age, like the epitome of the like imagine the man of society in 2023. Like he watches the game, he reads only the top 5 New York Times bestsellers. He's like the epitome of the mainstream. That person would be utterly insufferable year round, like no thoughts of their own. They would
Yeah.
be a contorted monstrosity, and yet they epitomize mainstream culture. Like I think
Yeah.
that's what you're saying. Like they would be such a caricature of
Yes.
obliviousness. It's like the opposite of integration. You're like it's like
Yes.
being a chimera of all your shadow possessions. You know?
They would have fully identified with the persona, the mask that is given them by their society, which
Yeah.
everybody has to wear a mask to a certain extent in order to make society function. But yeah, I like that notion of it's the opposite of individuation or integration, is to fully identify with the mask, right? Is to move as far away from your own unconscious, which isn't possible. So your shadow just draws out longer, right?
Right.
And and I don't recommend anybody watch it, but are you familiar with the movie? It was based on a book called American Psycho.
I have seen it. Yeah.
Oh, you have seen it, yeah. So
I'm
you
familiar
may
with it.
very well have been, yeah. So you know where I'm probably going with this is that
Yeah.
he strikes me as someone who is fully identified with the mask,
Excellent. Yes, I hadn't
and
realized that. That's a brilliant observation.
he's
I
yeah
think that's
he
completely true. That's probably the whole point of the movie
yeah
is that's like it's a cautionary tale of try it's what happens when you do fit in fully,
yes,
you know?
you fully fit in, and therefore, ironically, he is becomes a complete monster, his
Right.
shadow, and there's the implication that nothing that he does actually really happens, that he's just completely lost his
Yeah,
mind. But
let me build
um,
on that, which is what's the opposite of the American Psycho character, right? It's the integrated Jungian guy, and not to
yes,
toot our own theory here, but like the like you have a choice to make, dear viewer. Like which direction are you heading in? You know,
yeah,
maybe it's something to think about.
and the thing I love that question because it's far more often people will focus on painting an interesting villain and not know how to paint an interesting hero, um, which is a whole other thing. But the opposite of the American Psycho, I would almost posit, in line with what Jung said, but almost with, in my mind, a more optimistic tinge, would be, um, in a certain sense, they would maybe strike people as, I don't want to say just as crazy because he's pretty crazy in that film. Like he's not just as crazy because someone who they would still be able to function in society. I do firmly believe that someone who is integrated out of their love for other people, they are able to adapt themselves without, completely giving up of their principles. They would know how to adapt, to work with people, but they would still, there would, in some sense, there would still be this other side to them, but they would be more at peace with it. The American Psycho character is not at peace with himself at all. He's
The
he's
opposite.
he's the opposite. He's completely controlled by himself.
He's the epitome of a shadow possession.
Yes, and whereas the individuated person would have completely conquered that,
Right.
so that they may still come across as odd and strange because they're so honest with people, or so upfront in whatever way, but it would be they would not be controlled by it, and I believe they would be a genuinely very good person, a very moral person, not necessarily in line with the morality of their society, but in line with a deeper morality, a more true morality.
I really agree with you, and I don't
Yeah.
think that's articulated enough in the Jungian circles.
Yeah.
I think maybe it could be a lot of reasons, but maybe one is like the hesitation to bring any kind of moral language into it.
Yeah, it's very tricky, especially because it's like, well, people have been scarred by the way that people have acted in religious traditions and things. People these days, when they hear morality, they're very, very suspicious. And unfortunately, they have every right to be, because
Yeah.
they're often whipped with this. And yet, it can't. If I disagree with Jung, it's on what I feel sometimes he, in reaction to that, tries to get away from moral language. And sometimes I feel like he does that. He threatens to do that too much. And I'm like, if you do that too much, then it starts to actually become impossible to truly disambiguate between the American Psycho character and someone who's individuated there, because it would be like, well, maybe my individuation is to be a psychopath. And it's like, no, there's some other standard here that makes that, which we all recognize, and that isn't there to excruciate you and whip you, but is you know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. I would, along with the American Psycho, like archetype, so to speak, a movie archetype, is like there's a fable. I think it's about a bear in a forest, and it's the various animals in the forest ask the bear for favors. Like the rabbit's like, "Hey, can I have your ears?" And the bear is like, "Hey, I want to help you, so here are my ears." And then one by one, the bear obliterates himself,
Right.
and by making all the other forest creatures happy,
Right.
So that's like the American Psycho creature. And
Yeah.
in a way, the Jungian self-work is reclaiming those pieces.
Yes.
It's saying to the rabbit, I need that back, in the form of shadow work and recognizing projection, setting healthy boundaries,
Yes.
which is preventative care, which we didn't get to in this talk, but maybe another time. But that's it's not just new age, nonsense and theory and stuff. When you become more aware, I've said this a lot on this talk, but it bears repeating. Increased awareness gives you more choices, and if you want to better your life, you want the most choices you can, so you can make the best ones you have available. People often say they did the best they could with the knowledge at the time. Well, that's fine, but don't you want to increase your level of awareness to have more of that kind of knowledge, to make your life and the life around you better? It's all of our choice to make, little by little. So, I want to turn it over to you for any closing remarks.
Yeah.
Where can people find you? What do you want people to know about typology? in like one sentence or something like that. And
Oh,
anything else?
yeah. Michael Pierce, that's who I am. You can find me on YouTube. If you type in Michael Pierce philosophy or Michael Pierce MBTI, you'll find my channel. Just look for my face. You'll find it. It'll be one of the ones up there. Hint: I am not the football player. There's, we bear a very striking resemblance. You know, he is like 6 feet tall and African American, and and then you have me. So I'm not him, but that's the main place where I do stuff. The other main resource is my book, Motes and Beams: A Neo-Jungian Theory of Typology. You can find that on Amazon. If you type in Motes and Beams Michael Pierce, that'll definitely come up. You can also get an ebook version at a link which will be under this video, presumably, because I don't know it off the top of my head. Yeah, as far as typology goes, that would probably be, you know what, actually, my one sentence thing for typology
Go for it.
of why you should study it and its importance is, for me, it increases your love for other people and the profound sense of the word, because you are able to overlook, you gain the strength to overlook faults, not because you're afraid of them, but because you're strong enough to be like, you know what, I can bear some of your burden because I understand you better. That has been one of the big things for me, is it's increased my love for other people in a practical sense. So that's sort of the ultimate element of it.
Absolutely, I hear that. Well, I'll have all those links below. The description will just be cluttered with goodness, dear viewer. So be sure and check it out. Check out his videos if you're curious about a certain type. That's how I found him. He has great videos on each of the types. They're very hell. You have multiple videos on the various types.
I do. I have the 16 types, the original series I did, and then I have the types revisited, which is all 16 of the types. Totally different videos adding on to what I did with the first series. So
yeah, those are like well edited and very they're pretty much I think they're the best concise videos on each of the types that I've seen.
Thank you.
And they've aged really well. Like I know you did them years ago, but they have some serious lasting power. So good job on that. Yeah. Well, I'm going to end the video here. Thank you, viewer. Michael, can you hold on for a bit so we can debrief some housekeeping stuff?
Absolutely.
And just thank you so much for taking the time. This was a big talk on we're out here on the Oort cloud of YouTube, and you took a chance here. So I appreciate it very much.
I appreciate you having me. It was a really delightful conversation. Thank you.
All righty. Take care, y'all. See you all in the next video. Bye-bye.